You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
The middle-aged man felt angrier and angrier as he drove home from his latest doctor's appointment. The man had been to see the doctor 4 times about his breathing difficulties, and each time the doctor had taken chest x-rays, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong. The doctor thought that, medically speaking, the man was fine, but the man knew he was far from fine. He couldn't even climb a flight of stairs without taking countless breaks to catch his breath. And once he got into bed, he could barely muster the strength to get back out again. He was now missing work, and he was feeling so weak that it was getting hard to do much of anything. And so how could any doctor say that he was fine? After he pulled into the driveway, the man just sat there for a moment. And as he did, he realized that the feeling he was having right now was not just a feeling of frustration. He also had a much darker feeling. And that feeling was that one of these nights he was going to go to bed and not wake up again. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please attach a very active hornet's nest to the inside of the Follow Button's toilet bowl, and then close the lid and walk away. The world can be a scary place, especially when it comes to getting sick. You could catch a virus at the gym, you could pick up a foodborne bacteria at your local restaurant, or you could even get bit by a deadly bug out for a walk on your favorite hiking trail. I mean, there are dangers everywhere, and so sometimes it just feels safer to stay at home, safe and sound on the couch. But in this episode, you'll hear 2 stories about people who found out just how dangerous staying home can actually be. Our first story is about a man in Scotland whose house becomes a living nightmare. And our second story is about a young man in Australia who found out that just sitting on your couch can actually become a health disaster. Here is our first story called A Step Too Far. On a Saturday afternoon in August of 2016, 43-year-old Philip Mackey dragged a ladder into his bathroom. Philip and his wife Marnie were working hard to fix up their home in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. And Philip, frankly, spent a lot of his weekends on these types of home improvement projects, so this was very typical. Philip carefully opened up the ladder in a corner of the bathroom and climbed up. Once he was up there, Marnie handed him a spray bottle that contained water and bleach, and then she stood back to supervise from the doorway. Philip sprayed the mixture liberally onto a cluster of mold that had grown in the corner of the room. It occurred to him that he probably should wear a face mask, but it was too late for that now. When Philip was done, he tossed the spray bottle back down to Marnie, who caught it in one hand, and then laughed at what an efficient home improvement team they had become. Philip checked his watch, and to his surprise, it was almost 5 p.m. He realized he needed to jump in the shower right away. Philip played saxophone and guitar for a local band on the weekends, and they had a show tonight. He needed to get going soon if he wanted to be on time. So he moved the ladder out of the way and turned on the shower. "15 minutes later, Philip toweled off and pulled some clothes out of his closet. He laid them out on the bed next to their cat, who was fast asleep in a tight little ball. As Philip threw his shirt on, he took a moment to look around his bedroom. The fresh coat of paint that he and Marnie had applied to the room only a week ago made the room look so polished. They'd also hung new curtains and bought a cozy feather comforter and down pillows for the bed, and so they were really starting to turn their house into a home. Philip was now running late, so he buttoned his shirt as fast as he could as he hurried down the stairs. But when he got to the landing and reached for his jacket, he had to pause to catch his breath. Philip could feel his heart pounding. It had been a while since he'd been to the gym, but he hadn't realized he was this out of shape. He felt a little embarrassed, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Philip was in a hurry, so he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. By the time Philip walked into the pub down the road, his pulse was back to normal and he felt okay. The band would play a great show, but by the end of the show, Philip was once again totally out of breath. and so he decided he would just need to get more exercise because he was too young to get this winded so easily. A few days later, Philip got home from work around 5 p.m. He tossed off his jacket and bounded up the stairs to his bedroom. But once again, he felt his heart start to pound about halfway up the stairs, and he had to stop to catch his breath. Marnie appeared at the top of the landing and asked if he was okay, and Philip just shook his head and said no. But then he kind of playfully told her that, hey, I'm just totally out of shape. But one morning, 2 weeks later, Philip's problems got worse. He was walking up the stairs very slowly, trying not to spill his cup of coffee, and he had only made it up to the third step when his vision became blurry and he suddenly felt very dizzy, and so Philip gripped the railing to keep from falling. Then Philip began to feel breathless, and so instinctively he just sat down and put his coffee down, and he hung his head between his knees for a few minutes until the dizziness passed. And then finally, when Philip was feeling normal again, but still just sitting there on the stairs, Philip was terrified, and so he rushed downstairs, he grabbed his phone, and he called the doctor to make an appointment. Later that week, Philip was sitting in his doctor's office. He had been coming to this general practitioner for years, and Philip trusted that he'd be able to help him. His doctor sat across from him on a stool, listening as Philip listed off his symptoms: shortness of breath, pounding heart, and dizzy spells. The doctor nodded and told Philip that he most likely had a lower respiratory infection. He said there'd been a virus going around recently, and a lot of his patients had chest congestion. He was going to run some blood tests as well, just to be sure it wasn't anything serious. But in the meantime, the doctor said he would put Philip on antibiotics for a few days, which should help Philip feel like himself again. Philip thanked the doctor and then drove straight to the pharmacy to pick up the antibiotics. And by the next afternoon, Philip was starting to feel like he had some energy again. Also, his blood tests had come back clean, and so it seemed like the antibiotics were working. But the following evening, Philip came home from work feeling absolutely exhausted. He'd barely moved all day at the office, and yet here he was, feeling like he was going to fall asleep standing up. Philip made his way to the stairs, and he leaned hard on the railing as he took the first 2 steps, but immediately he could tell his heart was racing. He went up another couple of steps, but it felt like he had just sprinted a mile, and so he stopped and bent over and began wheezing for air. Finally, he just sat down on the steps, and he leaned back on his elbows and did his best to try to take slow, even breaths. But even still, it just felt like there was this huge weight on his chest that was keeping him from breathing in fully. After a few minutes, Philip heard footsteps coming down the stairs, and he knew it was his wife Marnie coming to help him. And a moment later, he felt her hand on his back, and he let her guide him to his feet. Philip leaned heavily on Marnie's shoulder as they slowly walked up, one step at a time. And then when Philip finally made it upstairs and lurched into the bedroom, he looked at the clock and he realized it had taken him 30 minutes to climb the stairs. But at this point, Philip was so exhausted that he just collapsed into the bed and asked his wife to close the curtains. He was going to attempt to sleep off whatever was going on with him. Over the next 10 days, Philip carefully took the course of antibiotics his doctor had prescribed him, but now it just didn't seem like they were doing anything. He was tired and dizzy at work. He barely had the energy to make it through his band sets every weekend. He was out of breath and exhausted basically all the time. But Philip kept hoping that he'd eventually just feel better, that he would just kind of sleep this off. One morning in October, so about 6 weeks after Philip had finished his course of antibiotics, Philip opened his eyes and immediately struggled to sit up. He rested for a moment on his back with his feet dangling off the edge of the bed, and then when he tried to sit up again, he realized that he genuinely couldn't do it. He did not have the strength just to sit up in bed. But he was feeling so defeated that he just rolled over and yelled out to his wife to please call his office and let them know he was not going to be able to come into work. Then Philip just closed his eyes and slept for the entire rest of the day. But later that night at around 2 a.m., so technically the next morning, Philip did finally wake up, but when he did, he again felt that intense pressure on his chest that made it hard to breathe. Except this time, the pressure was so intense, he literally felt like he was suffocating. And Philip's flailing woke up his wife, and as soon as she looked over and saw her husband was having this emergency, she reached for her phone to call the hospital. But right at that exact moment, Philip's lungs relaxed just enough to allow him to take in a full breath of air. And so suddenly he was calmed down for a second, and he just grabbed his wife's arm and he told her, "Don't call an ambulance." Marnie was caught off guard by his request, and so she flipped on the light and just stared at her husband, but she did put the phone down. And she would agree not to call an ambulance, but she told Philip they were done waiting whatever this was out, that he would, very soon, need to seek out medical help. Several weeks later, Philip sat in his longtime doctor's office feeling frustrated and exhausted as he waited for yet another set of x-rays of his chest. He was hoping that this time, the x-ray would actually show them why he was struggling to breathe. But this was the fourth appointment he'd made this month, and each time so far, the x-ray had come back looking totally normal. And without fail, his doctor would tell him that, hey, everything looks fine, and Philip would go home without any answers. Now, Philip trusted that his doctor knew what he was doing, but Philip was feeling extremely anxious and upset that his medical issues were still going undiagnosed. Philip was now spending most of his time in bed asleep. He had no energy, he hadn't been to work in over a month, and if he didn't get better, he would not be able to go back to work at all. And that would plunge him and Marnie into financial crisis. But that was just their financial situation. Philip also could feel his body literally breaking down. He was worried that eventually whatever was going on with him was going to kill him. Philip looked up when the door to the exam room opened, and he saw his doctor walk in, shaking his head solemnly. The doctor cleared his throat and told Philip that, once again, his x-ray looked totally normal. When Philip heard this, he just kind of snapped. Months of exhaustion and anxiety had finally bubbled up, and he just began to cry. He told his doctor that he just couldn't go on like this. The doctor sighed and nodded, agreeing that Philip was way too young to be in such dire health. The doctor was starting to suspect that Philip might need the advice of a specialist. There was a nearby clinic that specialized in urgent respiratory conditions, and the doctor promised he would call them ASAP. Philip thanked the doctor, but truthfully, he was skeptical about whether the specialist could actually help. But at the same time, he welcomed a new perspective because he was starting to give up hope. Later that day, Dr. Owen Dempsey opened up an email from Philip's general practitioner. Dr. Dempsey was a highly respected chest physician at BMI Albin Hospital, which was located only 30 minutes up the road from where Philip lived. Half an hour earlier, Philip's doctor had called Dr. Dempsey to tell him that, Philip was suffering from extreme shortness of breath and exhaustion and needed help right away. Dr. Dempsey clicked on the email attachment, which was Philip's x-ray, and it popped up on the screen. Dr. Dempsey looked it over carefully. For the most part, Philip had healthy-looking lungs. However, something strange immediately jumped out at the chest physician. He noticed that Philip's lungs appeared slightly gray, almost like someone had shaded them in with a pencil. Now, Dr. Dempsey could understand why Philip's doctor had said that everything looked normal. The grayness was actually so faint that at first, he actually thought it was a defect in the x-ray film. And so, Dr. Dempsey could clearly see why Philip's doctor had said the x-rays looked normal, because they basically did. But with Dr. Dempsey's deep knowledge of the human chest, he knew that Philip's lungs were not normal at all. The slight grayness in Philip's lungs indicated they were inflamed and that something was seriously wrong. So Dr. Dempsey decided to call Philip and see if he could figure out if anything in his environment or daily habits might be making him sick. Dr. Dempsey dialed Philip's number. After 3 rings, Philip answered, and Dr. Dempsey noticed right away that Philip was panting. Dr. Dempsey had lung cancer patients who sounded better than Philip. Philip explained that the reason he was currently so out of breath was because he walked through his house to answer the phone. That was it. Dr. Dempsey was shocked. But when he told Philip how surprised he was at Philip's shortness of breath, Philip just laughed and said he was surprised too. He said it was getting really hard to think of himself as a healthy person now that he needed half an hour just to climb his own stairs. Dr. Dempsey knew that Philip must be incredibly stressed out, and he appreciated that Philip was actually still finding ways to make light of his situation. But as desperately as Dr. Dempsey wanted to help Philip out, he really had no idea how to do it. Dr. Dempsey told Philip that he believed he could be suffering from a severe allergic reaction. Things people have in their homes, like black mold or pet dander, can trigger severe and sometimes dangerous allergic reactions. And other times, people can bring things into their home from a trip that ultimately triggers an allergy. For a moment, all Dr. Dempsey heard was just wheezing on the other end of the line. And then Philip spoke, and he told the doctor that, for the past few months, he'd barely gotten out of bed, so he certainly wasn't traveling anywhere, even within his own community. And Philip couldn't think of anything in his house that could have caused such a terrible reaction. He said there was nothing new, just the same pets they'd had for years. Now, Philip did mention that there was some mold in their bathroom, but he'd taken care of it months ago and it never came back. The doctor eventually just began to quiz Philip about potential ways he could have been exposed. And time and again, Philip shot each of them down. Even before he got sick, Philip didn't go to a health spa or other humid environments where mold could grow. He rarely went into his attic, which can also harbor mold. And since he'd gotten sick, they'd stopped remodeling the house, so he definitely was not exposing himself to any kind of home improvement chemicals. Philip said he didn't even smoke. And so by the time Dr. Dempsey had gone through his whole checklist of hazards and come up empty, he could tell Philip was close to tears. And Dr. Dempsey totally understood, because if he were in Philip's position, he would be just as scared and frustrated. Dr. Dempsey felt stumped. Nothing Philip had been exposed to recently sounded like cause for concern. So he asked Philip about the work he was doing on his house before he got sick. And Philip began describing all the painting and reupholstering they'd been doing. And in the background, Dr. Dempsey could hear Philip's wife, Marnie, reminding Philip about all sorts of other small projects they'd taken on over the past year. And at some point, Philip began rambling about his bedroom, something he was obviously very proud of. And he would tell Dr. Dempsey that they had really splurged on linen curtains and a brand new comforter. And right at that moment, as he was describing his bedroom, Dr. Dempsey had an epiphany. He suddenly understood what very likely was making Philip so sick. And so he cut Philip off and said, "How soon can you come in and get blood work done?" A few days later, Philip and Marnie sat in Dr. Dempsey's office as they went over the results of Philip's recent blood work. Dr. Dempsey smiled at them and reassured them that he did finally have a diagnosis. Dr. Dempsey explained that, generally speaking, people do not suddenly become allergic to things that they're exposed to regularly, things like pets. And even if Philip did inhale that mold in the bathroom when he was doing those home renovations, his illness should have gone away when he was no longer exposed to the mold. But when Philip told Dr. Dempsey on that phone call that he and his wife were really excited about the changes they had made to their bedroom and they had splurged on the linens and the comforter on their bed, that is what tipped Dr. Dempsey off that potentially Philip could be suffering from a very specific and very rare disease. And it would turn out Dr. Dempsey's hunch was correct. Philip's blood tests had revealed that he was having a severe allergic reaction to bird feathers. This is known as hypersensitivity pneumonitis. But not feathers from a pet bird or birds in the yard. When Philip and Marnie redid their bedroom, they'd replaced their synthetic comforter and pillows with more expensive ones that were filled with feathers. Philip was allergic to the bed that he'd been laying in for months. That's why he kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. The doctor explained that this very strange disease is quite rare, but it is so often triggered by people's bedding that medical professionals sometimes refer to this disease as feather duvet lung disease. Duvet is another word for comforter. Although Philip had never been bothered by feathers before, Dr. Dempsey told him that symptoms of hypersensitivity pneumonitis can develop quickly and worsen as time goes by. Without treatment, hypersensitivity pneumonitis can cause permanent damage to the lungs. But thankfully, Dr. Dempsey assured him that they had caught the disease in time. Dr. Dempsey prescribed Philip steroids, and Philip got rid of the feather comforter and pillows. Within 2 days, Philip was already feeling better. And within a few weeks, he was back at work and back to playing his saxophone in bars all across Scotland. And now for our second story, which is called Dying of Boredom. In December of 2019, 17-year-old Kyle Quitman took a deep breath of fresh air as a hospital volunteer wheeled him out the front door of a hospital in Queensland, Australia. Now, at the time, most of Kyle's friends were out celebrating the end of the school year. But Kyle had been in the hospital, having ankle reconstruction surgery to repair a really bad rugby injury. Kyle wished he could be at the beach right now with his friends, but after 3 days of being stuck inside the hospital, he was at least happy just to feel the sun on his skin. And it occurred to him that he really should try to enjoy this moment, because he was going to be mostly stuck inside for the next 3 months as his ankle healed, and while all his friends enjoyed the Australian summer that runs through February. The hospital volunteer parked Kyle's wheelchair on the curb and asked how his ankle was feeling. Kyle could feel it throb inside his cast, and he admitted that it was actually pretty tender. But a moment later, he saw his dad's car come around the corner, and suddenly he forgot all about the pain. All Kyle wanted was just to go home with his dad. Kyle's dad hopped out of the car and helped Kyle out of his wheelchair. Kyle's legs were a little shaky after 3 days on his back, but he leaned on his dad and managed to limp his way to the front passenger seat. Then off they went. The minute Kyle hobbled into his home, he could see that his mother had been carefully preparing for his arrival. She made the couch in the living room as inviting as possible, complete with fluffy pillows and his favorite blanket. There was a TV tray set up next to the couch with the TV remote, his gaming controllers, and a little bowl of candy sitting on it. Kyle smiled at all the amazing comforts his mother had assembled, but at the same time he sort of frowned because this was also where he knew he would be spending basically all of his time for the next 12 weeks, and as nice as it was, it felt pretty cramped. But in the end, Kyle just collapsed onto the couch, grabbed a controller, and started gaming. 4 days later, Kyle lay on the couch, a bowl of popcorn balancing on his stomach, as he listened to the family's pet cockatiel, Larry, repeat his name over and over again in a sing-song voice. Larry had a lot of personality, and Kyle loved to play with him. He had spent the morning trying to flick kernels across the living room and into Larry's cage. Kyle rolled a kernel in between his thumb and forefinger and then launched it across the room, and amazingly, it sailed right through the metal bars, right into the cage, and Kyle cheered as the cockatiel whistled his appreciation. But then Kyle sighed. Larry was amusing, but this had to be the most boring summer vacation of his life. A few of Kyle's friends had dropped by the night before with cookies and Gatorade, which was great, but then they all left for a party without Kyle, and he felt totally abandoned. In fact, the only person who spent any real time with him was his grandmother. She'd been coming over just about every single day to give Kyle cookies, and she would even play video games with him, but she was not good at video games. And Kyle really appreciated that, but again, he just felt totally bored and lonely. But perhaps the worst part of what Kyle was calling his, quote, couch arrest, was that he still had 77 more days of being stuck in here with nothing to do except wait for his ankle to heal. So, frustrated, Kyle grabbed another kernel and launched it into Larry's cage. A moment later, Kyle heard the garage door opening, and he knew that meant his mother was back with his 14-year-old brother, Dylan, and 2 of his friends. Within seconds, 3 14-year-olds zoomed past Kyle as he sat there on the couch, and they raced out to the indoor pool that was separated from the living room by a sliding glass door. Kyle huffed and sarcastically called after them to have fun, but he didn't need to worry. All 3 teens jumped into the pool and began roughhousing, splashing water, and having a great time. Kyle's mom, Sherry, came into the living room right behind the kids, carrying a few grocery bags. As Dylan and his friends shouted and splashed around in the background, Kyle's mother told him that she was so sorry he couldn't be outside this summer. Then Kyle watched as his mother opened Larry the cockatiel's cage and set the bird on the floor for his daily walk around the living room. And as Larry began picking up popcorn kernels in his beak and marching around the room, Kyle, for the first time in his life, felt jealous of a bird. The next morning, Kyle's throat felt scratchy as he slowly came down the stairs from his bedroom. And when he coughed, he could feel phlegm coming up into his throat. As if Kyle didn't have enough problems, now he realized that he must have caught a cold from Dylan or one of his friends who came over the day before. But luckily, Kyle's mother was basically a mind reader, because moments later, she came rushing into the living room where Kyle was, and she set a few throat lozenges down next to him. She told him she'd had a cough too the week before, and she promised Kyle that his cold would likely clear up in just a day or two. 3 days later, in mid-December, Kyle was sitting on the couch as usual playing video games. He had just won a match in his favorite fighting game when he started coughing. But this time he was coughing really hard. He tried to steady his breathing, but he was hacking so much that he felt like he was fighting just to get air. Kyle wondered if maybe he was hunched over too much and kind of compressing his diaphragm. So he sat up for a minute and then just lay down on his back. But even then, he still couldn't get a full breath, and in fact, it felt like he had just run up a flight of stairs. Eventually, Kyle did get his breathing under control, but those few panicky minutes really rattled him. Later that afternoon, Kyle was laying on his back with Larry the cockatiel on his chest. Kyle was petting the bird when he felt himself struggling to breathe again. Larry fluttered to the ground as Kyle doubled over in another coughing fit. After a moment, Kyle heard footsteps coming swiftly toward the living room, and he knew his mom had heard him coughing. Moments later, Kyle's mom came flying into the room, and she put the back of her hand against Kyle's forehead, and she said he was burning up. She wondered aloud if Kyle maybe had an infection or some other complication from his surgery. Then she told Kyle that if he wasn't feeling better in the morning, they were going back to the hospital. And sure enough, by the following morning, Kyle was much worse. His stomach felt upset and his sheets were damp with sweat. His head was pounding so hard that he couldn't even open his eyes. He called out for his mom and cracked his eyelid just enough to see her come into the room. Kyle asked her for some aspirin, but Sherry thought he needed more help than that. She was going to stick to her guns and take him back to the hospital. About an hour later, Kyle laid back on the table in an examination room, his hands over his face to block the overhead light from hitting his super sensitive eyes. A doctor looked over Kyle's chart and asked if he had traveled recently or been exposed to anyone who was sick. Kyle scoffed at the idea he had been traveling anywhere and told the doctor that he hadn't left the house for 10 days. But Kyle had to admit he had been around some sick people. His brother had been out and about with friends constantly, and he had come home with a cough just last week. Kyle's mom also chimed in and said she too had a cough last week, and in fact, now that she thought about it, she'd had a cough on and off quite a bit lately. But Sherry assumed she must have gotten it from Kyle's grandmother, who'd had a cold for weeks, and she came over all the time to visit. The doctor nodded and said that it was possible that Kyle had caught the same bug that had made other family members sick. But for some reason, Kyle's symptoms seemed to be much worse than anyone else's. The doctor asked Kyle to sit up, and once he had, he pressed his stethoscope to Kyle's back. Kyle tried to breathe deeply, but he felt like there was rattling in his chest, and it was hard to fully fill his lungs with air. After listening for a minute, the doctor stepped back, frowning. He looked at Kyle, and then he looked over at Kyle's mother, and then he told them that he heard crackling in Kyle's lungs, which indicated he very likely had a fluid buildup in his chest. He told them this was extremely unusual, especially for a healthy 17-year-old with no history of respiratory issues. So whatever was making Kyle sick, it had to be serious. Kyle just stared at the doctor in disbelief, and then between his ragged breaths, he asked the doctor if he was going to be okay. The doctor told Kyle not to panic, but they would have to run a whole battery of tests to figure out what was going on with him. The doctor said it was possible that Kyle had an autoimmune disease like lupus. However, the doctor thought it was far more likely that Kyle was suffering from some kind of infection. So the doctor said he was going to send an occupational hygienist to the Quitman's home to see if there was something in their environment that was making Kyle sick. Meanwhile, Kyle would need to spend the night at the hospital for testing. As Kyle listened to the scary-sounding things the doctor was saying, he found it very difficult to stay calm. If there was something deadly hidden in the Quitman residence, he knew he'd been breathing it in for 24 hours a day, non-stop for over a week. And the rest of his family could also be in serious danger too. The next morning, Kyle woke up in his hospital bed trying not to move for fear that he would set off another coughing fit. Even though he was exhausted, he couldn't sleep the night before. Between the intense pain in his chest and the fear of what might be wrong with him, it had been very hard to relax. As he watched the TV to distract himself, his doctor gently knocked on the door frame and came inside. He told Kyle that he had some good news and bad news. The good news was, so far, all of Kyle's tests had come back negative, which ruled out an autoimmune disorder and a host of other diseases. But the bad news was, the occupational hygienist had found some possible causes for what was making Kyle sick. There were traces of mold in the Quitman's house, and the hygienist was also concerned about the family's pet cockatiel, Larry. Birds could carry all sorts of diseases, and their feathers could also set off severe respiratory issues, like what was happening to Kyle right now. When Kyle heard this, he just put his hands over his face and he groaned. He had most likely been breathing in that mold around the clock, and Larry the cockatiel had been keeping him company the entire time. Kyle asked the doctor if they'd have to get rid of their beloved bird in order to get better. The doctor shrugged and said he couldn't be sure yet. To find out what was actually infecting Kyle's lungs, they would have to insert a tube into Kyle's lungs to take a sample of the fluids. The doctor told him that that procedure is called a bronchoalveolar lavage, and when he said that, Kyle's eyes widened. Any procedure with a name that complicated had to be painful. But the doctor smiled when he saw Kyle's reaction, and he reassured him that he'd be asleep for the whole 2-hour procedure and he wouldn't feel a thing. Kyle was relieved. Now he just hoped that this test would get him the answers that he needed. Later that day, Kyle was back in his hospital room, still a bit groggy from the anesthesia from the procedure. But when the doctor came in, Kyle was aware enough to notice the very serious look on his doctor's face. The doctor said that, once again, he had good news and bad news. He said the good news was they found what was making Kyle sick, but it was not mold or Larry the cockatiel. For a moment, Kyle felt really happy that his beloved pet would not have to be exiled from the family home. But then the doctor told him the bad news. Kyle's lungs were infected with a toxic bacteria called Mycobacterium intracellular, which can be extremely dangerous. If left untreated, it could permanently damage his breathing and even cause heart failure. Before Kyle could freak out, the doctor said he was pretty sure they'd caught it early enough to avoid any serious health damage for Kyle and his family. But the Quitmans would not be safe until the source of this bacteria was located, and so the hygienist was heading back to Kyle's house right now to collect more samples. The next morning, Kyle's entire family gathered around his hospital bed while the doctor went over the hygienist's findings. The air and water samples that the hygienist had collected confirmed that the danger was coming from an unexpected place: the Quitman's indoor pool. The pool water was full of the same bacteria doctors found in Kyle's lungs, and every time people splashed around in the water, they were inadvertently spreading the bacteria up into the air. Kyle had gotten sick because he had been breathing in the unsanitary pool water. Kyle and his family would soon learn that this bacteria had been growing in their pool for months, basically right after they had switched to a different filtration system. So the entire family had been breathing in this bacteria, but Kyle got much sicker than everybody else because he was laid up on the couch right next to the pool room for 2 weeks, just sitting there breathing in that filth day in and day out. Kyle's unusual condition is known as hot tub lung, since most people get it from breathing in humid hot tub water. Kyle's family immediately had their pool deep cleaned, and they also installed a new filtration system. And pretty quickly they all recovered and went back to their normal lives. But 2 years after the ordeal, the entire Quitman family went to a follow-up doctor's appointment and realized they had actually suffered permanent injury from their run-in with hot tub lung. Tests showed that all of their lungs now had a mild reduction in their ability to process poisonous carbon monoxide gas. It was a small but lingering reminder to make sure to always keep their pool nice and clean. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Lan. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zair. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballin, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery.
You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
Early one morning, a concerned mother sat beside her young son inside of a hospital room. He was lying in the bed, curled into a ball, and he was drenched with sweat, and he was clutching his stomach. His doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and until they did, they couldn't cure him. For now, all they could do was keep the boy hydrated and hope for a breakthrough. But, judging from how miserable her son looked, it didn't seem like the doctors were helping at all. The mother was starting to get worried that her little boy's life was in danger. The mother stood up to call the nurse when all of a sudden she felt dizzy and lightheaded. She sat back down and realized she was starting to sweat. A lot. This was exactly how her son's illness had started. Whatever he had, now she had it too. What she didn't know, though, was that thousands of other people were experiencing the same terrifying symptoms too. This was just the beginning of an outbreak that would spread across the entire United States. And there was no cure in sight. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please offer to detail the Follow Button's car, but be sure to hide a slightly open can of tuna under their front seat. This episode is called Common Ground. On August 8th, 1998, Sharon Anderson's eyes shot open to the sound of her 8-year-old son's wailing. She glanced over at the bedside clock and saw it was only 4 a.m. Toby, her son, was a very deep sleeper, so she knew it had to be something serious to wake him up at this hour. So Sharon jumped out of bed and rushed down the hall to his room. Toby was still in his bed, and he was holding his belly with both hands. He was covered by a film of sweat, and he was moaning in pain. Sharon laid the back of her hand on Toby's forehead, and she found that he was burning hot. In fact, he felt much hotter than when he normally got sick. Sharon knew her son needed medical attention right now. She rushed back to her bedroom, woke up her husband, and told him to go get the car ready so they could drive their son to the emergency room. Then she ran back to Toby's room, she scooped him up in a blanket, and carried him down the hall. It was still dark out as Sharon and her husband loaded Toby into their car. Fortunately, the streets of Minneapolis were empty at that hour as they raced to the nearest hospital. Attending physician Dr. Jean Miller was just starting her shift when her office intercom buzzed and a voice announced that an 8-year-old boy named Toby had just been wheeled into the ER. His mother, Sharon, said Toby had been feverish for hours and was throwing up. Dr. Miller jumped up from her desk and dashed down the hall to the emergency room. She found Toby lying in bed, his eyes half open and his skin drained of color, while his pajamas were dark with sweat. The boy's parents hovered beside the bed, looking worried and helpless. Dr. Miller called for a nurse to bring an IV saline drip to get some fluids into the boy. Then she measured his heartbeat and listened to his breathing. But the child's intense stomach pains suggested that whatever was going on was an intestinal issue. That covered a lot of possibilities, from food poisoning to something much more serious like appendicitis. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents if he'd eaten anything unusual lately. They looked at each other and listed various meals from the past few days, but then said that nothing out of the ordinary came to mind. Dr. Miller nodded, then asked Toby where it hurt most. With very shaky hands, Toby pointed to his stomach. Tears formed in his eyes, and he told Dr. Miller the pain was getting even worse. Dr. Miller smiled calmly, doing her best to hide her concern that Toby seemed to be sinking. The doctor grabbed a phone off the wall and called the lab to order blood and stool samples. That would likely identify what was happening inside of Toby's body. The doctor was pretty sure it was some kind of food poisoning, but the boy's intense discomfort suggested that it could be more serious than your run-of-the-mill 24-hour stomach bug. Dr. Miller took the parents aside and told them to make a list of every food and every place that Toby had eaten in the past 4 days. Dr. Miller promised they would find out what was happening to their son, and they would do everything in their power to make him right again. A few hours later, Dr. Miller's phone rang. It was the lab with Toby's results. They found blood in Toby's stool, which indicated intestinal bleeding, most likely from bacteria in his food. So Dr. Miller had apparently been right. It was some kind of food poisoning. Now they needed to figure out what kind of food poisoning it was. The lab technician said they had already isolated the bacteria from Toby's stool for closer analysis. Dr. Miller thanked the technician and hung up. The good news was that they were now closer to knowing what was making Toby sick. But the bad news was, until then, Dr. Miller could not really aggressively treat Toby's illness. For many bacterial infections, the best treatment is antibiotics, but with certain strains of bacteria, such as highly toxic strains of E. coli, antibiotics can actually make the patient sicker or even kill them. So for now, all Dr. Miller could do was keep Toby's fever down with medication and his dehydration at bay with an IV drip. Dr. Miller checked in with Toby's parents and told them to get some rest and that she would be back at the hospital first thing in the morning. Then the doctor left the room and went to the night nurse and told her to please contact her at home if anything changed with Toby. The next morning, Dr. Miller had just sat down behind her desk with a mug of coffee when a nurse knocked on the door and poked her head in. She said there was a new arrival to the ER, a 4-year-old girl named Peyton Egger. She had a sweltering 104-degree fever, and her mother said she'd been vomiting on and off for 12 hours with repeated bouts of diarrhea. Dr. Miller's mind raced as she followed the nurse down to the emergency department. White curtains were drawn all around a gurney that had just been wheeled in. Little Peyton was lying on the gurney, drenched in sweat. Her face was drained of color, and she was struggling to keep her eyes open, and her parents stood to the side, clutching each other nervously. Dr. Miller immediately ordered the nurses to hook Peyton up to an IV drip while she checked the girl's vitals. Peyton's pulse was weak, and her blood pressure was dropping. Dr. Miller worried she might be going into shock, which could cause her organs to shut down. Dr. Miller realized that Peyton's symptoms were very similar to Toby's, so much so that she wondered if both kids had caught the same infection. Peyton's parents told Dr. Miller that their home was in a suburb north of Minneapolis, which was nowhere near where Toby's family lived. Still, Dr. Miller thought there must be something these two kids had in common. Dr. Miller called the lab and told them she wanted full blood work run on Peyton, plus stool samples tested as well. Then, Dr. Miller took Peyton's parents into the hallway and asked them for more details. The mother said that Peyton had been complaining of stomach pains last night, but it really hadn't seemed that serious. But at around midnight, Peyton woke up crying from all the pain and then began vomiting. After that, she kept vomiting nearly every hour and had several episodes of severe diarrhea. Then her temperature started spiking. By dawn, the parents said it was clear that whatever this was, it was only getting worse. So her parents had rushed her to the hospital. Dr. Miller said they had done the right thing. Peyton would be safe here. For now, the best thing they could do was just stay calm and wait. But that was advice Dr. Miller found easier to give than to practice. As Dr. Miller stepped out of Peyton's room and headed back to her office, a nurse hurried up to her and said the lab had been trying to reach her. Toby's new results were in. The boy was infected with a bacteria called Shigella. Finally, Dr. Miller knew what she was up against. Shigella attacks the digestive system, causing inflammation and bleeding within 12 to 48 hours after eating food contaminated with the bacteria. Toby had all of the classic symptoms: fever, abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea. Dr. Miller knew that if untreated, Shigella could send Toby into shock, which often leads to organ failure and occasionally even death. But at the same time, Dr. Miller was relieved. Although Shigella was obviously serious, it could be defeated with antibiotics, so she could finally start treating Toby. Dr. Miller told the attending nurse to prepare antibiotics for Toby and begin administering them as soon as they were ready. Then Dr. Miller rushed to Toby's room to give his parents the news. The boy was lying in his hospital bed with his eyes half open. His mother sat in a chair next to the bed, holding her son's hand and looking flushed and exhausted. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents to step outside with her so she could explain what was going on. But when Toby's mother tried to stand up, she wobbled and had to sit back down. She admitted she had not been feeling well since she woke up that morning. She said she even vomited a couple of times. Dr. Miller told Toby's mother to stay seated while she called for a nurse to prepare a bed for her. The doctor told her it was entirely possible that she was also now infected with Shigella, which was the bacteria that they had just discovered her son was infected with. After all, Shigella is so contagious that it can be passed in a handshake if someone who touched the bacteria didn't wash their hands well enough. As soon as Dr. Miller had settled Toby's mother into her own hospital bed, a receptionist waved the doctor down. It was the lab calling again. They had the results for Dr. Miller's other young patient, Peyton. She had Shigella too. Dr. Miller put down the phone. First Toby, then maybe Toby's mother, and now Peyton? Suddenly, Dr. Miller felt like she had an outbreak on her hands. And given how easily Shigella is transmitted, there were likely dozens more people out there suffering symptoms at home, and every one of those cases could make more people sick. Suddenly, Dr. Miller had a lot of calls to make. Later on that same afternoon in August of 1998, a young epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health named Dr. Julie Wickland was sitting at her desk when her secretary buzzed. She told her there was an urgent call coming in from a local hospital. Dr. Wickland was only in her 20s and still trying to prove herself professionally, but one thing she had already learned was that being an epidemiologist meant everything was a potential emergency. People's lives were always on the line. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Miller, who described the potential Shigella outbreak she was facing. 3 cases in her hospital, and likely a lot more people at home right now who just weren't sick enough to head to the hospital yet. But soon they would be. Once Dr. Wickland was done hearing from Dr. Miller, she requested to have Toby and Peyton's families fill out food history charts with everything they had eaten in the past 4 days. Then she met with her team at the Department of Health and assigned some of her best investigators to join her on this case. By the time she got back to her office, Dr. Wickland's secretary came in holding a stack of papers. The families had already filled out and faxed over their kids' food histories. Dr. Wickland spread them out on her desk and scanned them to look for commonalities. Right away, she noticed a pattern. They had all eaten at a restaurant called Roberta's. The odds were extremely low that both Toby and Peyton's families had eaten at the same place in the same 4-day window, especially considering how far apart they lived, and so this was exactly the type of breakthrough Dr. Wickland was hoping for. An hour later, Dr. Wickland and 2 other health officials stepped out of a dark sedan in front of the restaurant Roberta's, a modest neighborhood eatery. The manager was waiting for them by the entrance, looking very tense. The restaurant was temporarily closed for the rest of the day so that Dr. Wickland and her team could go and conduct their investigation there. Dr. Wickland needed to inspect every aspect of the restaurant's food handling for possible sources of contamination, such as spoiled food or dirty water. Dr. Wickland assigned 1 investigator to record the temperatures inside the refrigerators and freezers, while another investigator took water samples from all the sinks and taps. Then Dr. Wickland studied every step in the food's journey to the table, from the delivery area to the storage room to the food prep stations. The overall layout at Roberta's met safety standards. But Dr. Wickland knew how elusive Shigella could be. Shigella can show up almost anywhere and then can be spread by the people who are simply preparing the food. Dr. Wickland told the manager she needed to interview the entire staff. And so once the staff was gathered in the dining room, Dr. Wickland circled the room, asking each employee questions about their recent health and also their daily kitchen routine. Several members of the staff admitted to Dr. Wickland that they had not been feeling very good lately. Some had even been feverish and suffering pretty severe abdominal pains. It sounded worryingly similar to what Toby and Toby's mother and Peyton were all experiencing. Dr. Wickland then made copies of the restaurant's reservation list and credit card receipts from the past 4 days. Flipping through the pages, she estimated at least 400 people had eaten at Roberta's within a few days of when Dr. Miller's patients had eaten there. All of these diners were now at risk of getting Shigella. Back at the office, Dr. Wickland wrote up a questionnaire for all of Roberta's 400-plus diners. She needed to determine how many other customers out there were suffering similar symptoms. If any of them had contracted Shigella but didn't realize it, they could be infecting other people. These people needed to be notified right away, or else this situation could get much worse. The next morning, when Dr. Wickland arrived at her office, she learned that one of Roberta's employees had tested positive for Shigella. This confirmed that everyone who had eaten at the restaurant could now potentially be infected with the Shigella bacteria. But at least she now had a pretty good idea where the Shigella was coming from, a sick food prep worker who likely had not washed their hands properly. Dr. Wickland's first step was to call Roberta's and order the restaurant temporarily closed until the Shigella outbreak was totally contained. Then Dr. Wickland called Dr. Miller to get an update on her patients. Dr. Miller told her that Toby's mom was doing fine, but Toby and Peyton were struggling. Shigella is always harshest on the young and the elderly, and the children's conditions were not getting better. If they didn't start getting better soon, Dr. Miller feared they could go into shock and die. Early the next day, Dr. Wickland's phone rang with new results from the lab. Several more employees at Roberta's restaurant had tested positive for Shigella. This meant that the disease outbreak was not coming from a single unsanitary worker. It was coming from lots of places. Dr. Wickland got a fresh cup of coffee and then sat down at her desk to begin studying the first wave of questionnaire results from Roberta's recent customers. And she was disturbed to see that a full half of the 400 diners reported experiencing symptoms that were consistent with Shigella. But as Dr. Wickland studied the responses, something about the data just didn't seem right. A large percentage of infected diners had eaten at Roberta's before any of the employees started to get sick. So it was unlikely that the employees were giving the infection to the customers. The workers were actually victims too. Dr. Wickland leaned back in her chair and took a deep, defeated breath. She now realized that she actually had no idea where all the Shigella cases were coming from. An hour later, the manager at Roberta's unlocked the restaurant door and let in Dr. Wickland. She told the team to put on gloves and start discarding every piece of food in the building. Nothing could be saved. Roberta's manager was happy to comply, and Dr. Wickland told him the business could reopen once all the food had been thrown away and the entire restaurant professionally cleaned. They couldn't afford to take any chances. Dr. Wickland pulled a bin of produce off a shelf and dumped it in the trash. The Shigella was somewhere under this roof, and Dr. Wickland was not going to let it slip past her. Dr. Wickland returned to her office at the Department of Health to find a report sitting on her desk. Her heart sank. It was the details of another case of Shigella, this time north of Minneapolis. A 33-year-old woman had been rushed to a hospital after hours of vomiting, fever, and diarrhea. The night before, the woman had eaten at an upscale restaurant in her neighborhood called Marty's. Not only that, but she'd gone to the restaurant with multiple friends, all of whom had been contacted and reported feeling sick. But Marty's restaurant was very far from Roberta's. For this illness to strike two restaurants in entirely different areas, miles apart from one another, was extremely rare. Dr. Wickland sighed and called the manager at Marty's to tell them the restaurant would have to close until further notice. She said that a health official would be there shortly to collect their reservation list and credit card receipts, and all their recent diners would need to be contacted about the disease outbreak. Dr. Wickland then called a meeting with her investigators to brainstorm. She felt lucky that there had been no fatalities so far, but she also knew that young children were in the greatest danger. She told her team they had to find the link between Marty's restaurant and Roberta's restaurant that could explain all the Shigella cases. Maybe both restaurants sourced particular food items from the same place, or maybe an employee worked part-time at both restaurants, or maybe they shared a water supplier. Whatever it was, she told her team they had to go find out. By the next afternoon, Dr. Wickland had more information to go on. She and her team had worked around the clock, contacting people and compiling timelines of symptoms. It was a lot to sift through, but she knew it was always better to have too much information rather than not enough. As Dr. Wickland made her way through all the paper piled on her desk, the differences between the two restaurants really jumped out at her. Marty's got its water from a different reservoir than Roberta's, so this was not a water issue. There was also almost zero overlap in their menus because Roberta's and Marty's served very different types of food. And a review of the two restaurants' employees showed that no staff members worked in both places either. The researchers could not even identify a single food that all the sick customers at each restaurant had eaten. Everyone ordered different dishes, yet got sick the same way. And so Dr. Wickland wondered to herself, how could that be? This just doesn't seem possible. Just then, the phone rang. It was the lab with an update on the Marty's restaurant customers. Everyone who tested had come back positive for Shigella. The lab had also done a genetic comparison of the Shigella bacteria from the Marty's diners and the Roberta's diners, and they found them to be identical. Clearly, both restaurants had been contaminated by the same source. Dr. Wickland thanked the technician and hung up. She felt stumped, exhausted, and ready to call it quits for the day, but she did have a couple more calls to make. The first one just to check up on Toby and Peyton. On the other end of the line, Dr. Miller sounded equally exhausted. She said Toby was still bedridden because his body was not responding to the antibiotics. He was now faced with a painful and slow recovery. Little Peyton Egger was even worse. Dr. Miller had nurses monitoring her around the clock, but her family was obviously worried sick. Dr. Wickland thanked her for the update, then she hung up and scrolled through her Rolodex until she found the United States Centers for Disease Control. This outbreak was clearly not settling down the way Dr. Wickland hoped it would, and so it was time to call in reinforcements. Dr. Timothy Niemi was in his office packing up to head home when his phone rang. He considered letting it go to voicemail, but his position as an epidemic intelligence officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had taught him the danger of missing an emergency call. So he picked up the phone and he listened carefully as Dr. Wickland explained the events of the past week and how the Shigella outbreak showed no signs of slowing down. Dr. Wickland said she needed the CDC's help in finding the outbreak's origin so they could stop it. Every bacterial outbreak has its own genetic fingerprint that makes it unique, and the CDC keeps a massive database of these fingerprints from all over the world. Dr. Niemi told Dr. Wickland to email him an image of the Shigella bacteria's DNA profile. Then he could use the CDC's database to see if the same Shigella strain had been reported anywhere else. The moment Dr. Niemi uploaded the Shigella bacteria from Minnesota to his database, Shigella outbreaks in other areas popped up all over. From Los Angeles County to Boston to Florida, plus up in Canada, in Alberta and Ontario. Each outbreak had been linked to a specific restaurant, and all were genetically identical. This meant that there was a good chance all of these Shigella outbreaks were caused by the same source of contamination. The sheer breadth of locations baffled Dr. Naemi. He stared at the map. How did the same contaminant spread across both coasts, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and all the way up into Canada? He emailed his coworkers the results and asked them to help him contact every restaurant associated with an outbreak and compile a comprehensive list of foods and ingredients on their menus. There had to be something in common to all of them that was carrying this particular strain of Shigella. The next morning, one of Dr. Naemi's fellow investigators strolled into his office and handed him a Post-it note with one word written on it. Dr. Naemi read the note and couldn't help but laugh. The investigators had identified the probable source of the Shigella outbreak, and it was something that no one suspected. Dr. Naemi's department even had a term for this particular ingredient. They called it stealth food, because it's used in a wide variety of dishes, yet usually goes unnoticed. Dr. Naemi congratulated his team. This was the best lead they had. He picked up a phone and he called a colleague at the Food and Drug Administration named Jeremy Brown. Dr. Naemi told Jeremy what they had discovered and said he'd need the FDA's help tracing this particular ingredient, the stealth food, to the original supplier. Global supply chains for restaurants are incredibly complex, with foods shipping from across the world and constantly being reprocessed and repackaged, and so finding one bad batch of food among all of that would not be easy. Jeremy said he would get to work. A few days later, Jeremy rode in a Jeep through Ensenada, Mexico. At first, the countryside was dry and dusty, but as they curved over a hillside, suddenly everything turned green. For miles into the distance, Jeremy saw nothing but crops in organized rows. Finally, they turned onto a dirt road and passed a sign that said the name of the farm, Valle Verde. The farmhand pointed out different fields of produce, including tomatoes, celery, cilantro, green onions, radishes, and lettuces, all watered by massive irrigation machines. But the biggest spread of all was an entire 55-acre parcel devoted to growing nothing but the stealth food Jeremy had come to investigate. And the stealth food was parsley. At some point between when it was harvested and when it was shipped, this parsley was becoming contaminated with Shigella bacteria. Jeremy was not going to leave the farm until he found out where and how this was happening. The Jeep came to a stop on the banks of an old riverbed. Since tainted water is the most common cause of Shigella, Jeremy had requested to visit the farm's water supply first. The farmhand hopped out and led them to a series of wells that provided all of the farm's water. Jeremy looked inside one of them. The stone casing was old, but uncracked. The shaft was dug very deep, so that the water came from far underground, which meant the likelihood of contamination was actually quite small. Jeremy could tell the issue was not the wells. Next, the farmhand drove them past several meadows to a reservoir that served as the farm's backup water supply. It looked like a small fresh lake. The water seemed clean, but Jeremy still bottled up a couple of samples for testing back in the US. The farmhand asked Jeremy where he wanted to head next. Jeremy said he could use a break from the heat. It had gotten much hotter as the afternoon wore on. A few minutes later, the Jeep rumbled to a stop in front of a huge farm shed with a corrugated steel roof. It contained long conveyor belts stacked with crates of parsley. At the end of the line, men took those crates and stacked them on a pallet and then hosed them down with chilled water from a machine called a hydro cooler. Jeremy watched as hundreds of boxes quickly piled up and were loaded into the backs of huge trucks and then driven away to be shipped all across North America. Jeremy asked the farmhand if the water for the hydro cooler came from their wells or the reservoir, but the farmhand shook his head and said neither. The water for the hydro cooler came from Ensenada's municipal water supply. Jeremy put on his sunglasses and told the farmhand that that was where he needed to go next. At the municipal water plant, the facility's director admitted that they had been a bit overwhelmed lately. Due to government funding cutbacks, they had been understaffed for a while. With fewer security guards to watch the place, there had been a few break-ins lately, and some equipment had even been damaged. At one of the water filtration systems, Jeremy noticed that the machine that normally disinfects the water with chlorine was shut down. Jeremy asked the manager if the chlorinator had just been turned off today or if it really was not working at all. The manager shook his head in frustration and said this had been on their list to get fixed for over a month, but the city hadn't managed to send over the parts yet. Jeremy did his best to hide his shock. Without chlorine, all sorts of contaminants could flourish in the water, including Shigella. From there, the water was pumped to businesses, homes, and farms all over the area, like the parsley crop at Valle Verde. Jeremy filled several bottles to be tested and told the farmhand it was time to go. Days later, Jeremy got his results. Ensenada's municipal water was loaded with Shigella. And it was the same strain as the one found at Roberta's, Marty's, and all the other restaurants. The contaminated water had been sprayed directly onto the parsley right before being shipped to restaurants all across North America, where people like Toby, Peyton, and their families ate the parsley without giving it a second thought. Jeremy knew they had been lucky in tracking down the source relatively quickly. He estimated that as many as 1,000 diners had caught Shigella from one harvest of contaminated parsley, but it could have been so much worse. Fortunately, there were no fatalities, and both Toby and Peyton eventually made full recoveries. But very few of those who got sick will ever look at their parsley garnish the same way again. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballin, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery.